Well, hello, everyone. So glad for you tuning in to this little study again today. I appreciate so much that this can minister onto your heart. I know it certainly ministers onto mine, and I believe I would still do it. I know I would still do it, even if no one out there was really listening or desired to listen to it. The study does so much for me, and I never fail to come away with just a greater appreciation for God's love for me and God's love for his people, and just a greater I think I said it the other day. Obviously, there are things going on with the news, and we see all what's happening, and um, it just brings me to a place of sorrow in my heart. And I just say, God, why do you put up with any of us? Why do you have mercy on any of us when so much is done with so many different reasons and so many different motives, and everyone thinks that they're doing the right thing, and everybody claims to be following you, but yet we see differences in the way this is accomplished, and those from one side look at the other side and can't believe how anybody can believe that or how anybody can do that, and the fingers are pointing across the aisles, and just the disturbances that are happening in churches and in communities and in families. It breaks my heart. Breaks my heart. And I just cry out for God to have mercy upon us all as we go through this, and as he does whatever work he needs to do in us to that we would stay faithful, and that we would seek first the kingdom of God. And that's it. And that's it. And so we want to see here again these messages, the stories that we're reading here in First Samuel. Um, Last week was so timely. This week again, at least with me, just seems to resonate of like we're reading their mail and they're reading our mail, and this is history is repeating itself again in a fashion. And so as we pick up in First Samuel chapter 12, you see it on your screen, and Samuel is talking to Israel. And if you remember, they had asked for a king, and this transition is taking place. And so this is, again, very, very interesting that a transition is taking place from um, the prophet Samuel to the King Saul. And I don't even know how much to comment on this. I believe the words of the verses here will do far more than anything I can say. So Samuel is standing before the people. If you can try to picture this, they've gathered together. Um, there has just been a great deliverance that God has delivered through King Saul, and save the people from having their eyes poked out, basically. And so they've assembled at this coronation of the king and this transfer of uh, government, if you will. And so Samuel said to all Israel, again, please notice this is an interlinear reading from right to left, and this is as much as a word-for-word translation as you're going to get. And some people like that type, some people like paraphrase, but this is definitely as close to a word-for-word. And you'll see it doesn't flow very well because many times Hebrew doesn't need a verb to express the thought, which we do in English. And so pardon maybe the roughness, but I think the strength of the words and the power of the language will uh, make you feel what's happening here. And Samuel said to all of Israel, indeed, I have heeded your voice in all that you have said to me, and have made a king over you. So he gave in to what they wanted, and it wasn't what God wanted. And so he said, now here is the king walking before you. And here's where something is very interesting. This is his farewell speech. Again, the timing of this is just incredible. He says, I am old and gray-headed, and look, my sons are with you. Now, what's interesting here is we know from previous verses that his sons were scoundrels. His sons were not as bad, obviously, as remember the previous prophet and priest Eli. His sons Hophni and Phinehas were just exceedingly wicked. And but Samuel's sons did not follow in his footsteps. We don't know anything about Mrs. Samuel, where she is. We don't know anything about what his sons are doing. But what we see here is Samuel saying, "Okay, I'm old and gray-headed. My sons are with you," meaning that they're old enough. They've gone on their own. They're not under my ability to correct them or to discipline them anymore, and they've pretty much assimilated with the people and not followed after the priesthood. Um, and from my childhood, he says, I have walked with you this day, and here I am. Um, and So this is, again, very, very interesting. A witness, here I am, a witness before you. Um, of what God has done. And he talks about the anointed. Again, this is a very interesting word in Christian thoughts. When we read the New Testament, whenever we see Messiah, uh, in the Hebrew, it's translated to Christ. In the Greek, which means his anointed. But when we go back to the Hebrew, we see that it's Mashika, and it basically means an anointed one. It wasn't ever intended to be a last name. It was intended to be a descriptor. It was intended to give an understanding of the selection and the choosing of God. And so this word, we see it show up in the Hebrew, and it takes us back to just remember that, Saul is not the Messiah in the way that we are conditioned to think of Jesus as our Messiah. But he is the anointed one. He is the one that's chosen for this time. And yeah, again, just very interesting when you think of that Saul is chosen by God. Sometimes we confer maybe more, look at, I guess, before I answer that, let's look at what Saul's life is like, that even though he is the chosen one, um, watch his actions, watch his mannerism, watch the either temporary positions or temporary moments, and then what he becomes. Again, and then keep in that mind that he was chosen by God, but it was not a permanent thing. So this is an interesting thought here, as contrast to Jesus being chosen by God as a tabernacle for him to dwell in upon this earth, and that was a appointment, a chosen um, office that lasted through his life on earth, through his death, burial, and resurrection, and still exists today. We see that term being used. And so here's Saul is anointed by God, or through Samuel, and Samuel goes, have I done anything that you can find fault with me? um, Again, very interesting here. If you think of trying to find someone who leads a life that is without blemish, that no one can find fault for. Obviously, there are some who are better at this than others. There are some who you can find a lot of fault with. There's others you can find very little. But just think of a person that, as he puts this challenge out here, and he lists some specifics. He lists basically his dealings of how he interacted with them. And so, he says, who have I defrauded? Have I taken anybody's donkey or oxen? Have I cheated anyone or oppressed anyone? Have I taken any bribes? Has anybody given me money and then I perverted judgment or justice because of that? And verse 4 says, nope, you haven't cheated anyone. In not one instance, not one fault could they bring against him of any way in which he cheated them, lied to them, perverted justice. He was righteous in everything he did, and they affirm that. And, I understand Samuel being hurt by this. We know that in the beginning, when they came and desired a king, Samuel took it very, very seriously, and it broke his heart. And God actually came and spoke to him during this time when his heart was broken, and he said, you know, really, Samuel, I know you're taken back by this, but realize that they have not rejected you, Samuel, that they have rejected me. And that kind of, helped Samuel get through this, to know that this wasn't a personal thing. This was the way that their desires as a nation had gone, that they didn't want God to rule over them anymore. And what it doesn't go into is something that I think we have to look deeper for in the scriptures, is to find out the conditions of God's heart and how he felt during this time and how his heart had to have been broken. We see with Samuel how much his heart was broken. I have to imagine that there's no way we could put into words how God's heart was broken over this. Um, we can gain a little bit of empathy, a little bit of sympathy, but yet to really know how God's heart must have felt over being rejected in such a way, um, I think is beyond our mortal ability to comprehend. Although I do believe God shares some of that with us at various times, that he lets us into his realm of hurt, if you will, if our hearts are willing, if our minds are willing, if we're willing to allow ourselves to be grieved by the things that grieve God. Um, I know it occurs, and I know that that's many people's desire, is to have that close of a relationship with God, that the things that break God's heart would also break ours, and the things that motivate the Lord and please Him would also please us. A wonderful desire that is something for us to pray for and desire. So, as we continue studying this, we see that he's challenging them, and the people say, "We've not found anything against you, nothing in by your hand that you have done." And they say, "God is our witness." And then what's interesting here is verse 6. He starts going into a history lesson and showing how God had provided for them, how God had spoken to um, people, starting with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Aaron, and then he'll go into all the leaders that came in after that. I think what he's really trying to do is to show them that, even though it wasn't apparent who was going to take over for Samuel, that prior to this, when Eli and his sons were not doing what God wanted them to do, the people's heart must have still been inclined towards serving God, because he sent Samuel to them. And we know the story of how Samuel was conceived and born and dedicated to God. But yet, God didn't send a successor for Samuel. And I wonder if there were people who were praying for that, if people who are realizing, saying, okay, Samuel's old, his kids aren't following in the way, Lord, send us another prophet, send us someone to take over. You've never left us, you've never forsaken us, you've always sent someone here, do it again, Lord, send us another prophet. Was there a contingency in the Israelite camp that were doing that? We don't find any record of it, no mention of it whatsoever. Um, and yet, maybe God knew that where their hearts were. Obviously, He did, and He gave them the desire of their heart without them even really asking for it out loud, without them coming and demanding, that God do this. He gave them over to the desires of their heart, and that is, I don't know, that frightens me in a way, because we know how easily our hearts are deceived, and we know how easily we can be led astray. I, you know, Part of my prayer is, Lord, help me to do the right thing. Help me to not get contrary thoughts in my head, or let emotions distract me, or let pressures of this life, or peer pressure, or societal pressures. How can I separate fact from fiction, and all of the um, information that's coming our way? And everyone has an opinion, and everyone has a way that is seemingly right in their own eyes. How do I know the truth? How do I follow after what you want me to do? Because I see where people have been deceived. I know people who have been at one time, having a right relationship with God, and something has happened. and they've left that relationship. We see it, and we'll see it again in the scriptures here of men mightily used of God, men and prophets and kings mightily used of God who let things slip and whose end was not desirable. And if it can happen to them, I can't be so naive to think that it couldn't happen to myself or any one of us. And so, that in itself just says, Lord, help me to stay on track with you, as a motivation, as a desire to hear God's voice and to follow after his ways. And so Samuel starts down this path, advising the Israelites of everything God had done for them. In verse 8, how he had sent Moses and Aaron and brought them out of Egypt. And the sad epithet from that is what we see in verse 9, is that they forgot Yahweh their God. And again, the Hebrew helps us so much to understand. It would say Lord God in English, and if you look really close, the word for Lord is all capital letters, Lord, and God is capital G and then small o and d. But um, again, we don't get the impact the same way you do in the Hebrew, where you see that it's Yahweh Elohechem, that this is Yahweh. This is the compassionate, merciful, ever reaching outside of God, that he is there in both formats, the compassionate side expressed in the word Yahweh, and the masculine, protecting, sustaining, delivering side, which Elohechem is just the plural, meaning their God, of Elohim, which is also a plural, but this is making it personal. It's making it their God. And so they forgot both attributes of God. They forgot about his mercy. They forgot about his compassion, and they forgot about his sustaining power. We're going to see that here the emphasis seems to be on that they are more concerned about his provision and his sustaining power than they are his mercy. And so Samuel is reminding them that this is, so Yahweh comes first. I don't know if the order is particular here, but what we see that helps us realize that Samuel is trying to point out what I believe God's heart is reflecting, and that is his compassionate name. Prior to the word Yahweh, you see this little word here that isn't even translated. It's an alpha and a tau, which is the first letter and the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And you'll see underneath here, it has the abbreviation of DIR, capital O, BJM. This is in the full unabbreviated form. It's called a direct object marker. It is something used in Hebrew to show where the focus is on. We don't have anything like it in English or any other languages that most of us would be familiar with. It's not in Spanish, not in German, not in French that I'm aware of. It's in no other languages that I have studied other than the Hebrew and also in the Aramaic. But it is intended to show who the object is, who is being spoken about, what is the focus, where we kind of get that from the text and the conditions in English that we know who the object is. But here in Hebrew, it has the ability to take away all the question, take away all the doubt, and leave no uncertain terms that the object here is Yahweh. In fact, to even make it a little bit stronger, you see this little line over here is called the makaf, and it's really intended to be a joiner between the two words. So if you were reading this in Hebrew and you were fluent, you'd say et Yahweh, almost like one word, et Yahweh Elohim. And so Elohim. So it's intended to be all one word, saying this is the focus. This is what Israelites, you're supposed to know, is that you have forgotten the merciful side of God, the compassionate side of God. And I think that's probably a good place for us to stop today, as we leave with a thought of, in the realm of all what's happening, let us not forget compassion. Let us not forget that compassion and mercy and loving kindness are God's main attributes. And with the things that are happening in our world, it seems like these main attributes have been totally neglected, totally forgotten. The compassion, the trying to understand the situations that many have found them in that are beyond their control. Um, where are we in a compassionate position? Where's our heart in compassion for those around about us who are hurting, who are broken, who are disillusioned, who are totally distracted and living in fear because of what's going on around them and they don't know where to turn. Let's not forget that God's main attribute is compassion, and let that compassion that encompasses who He is be found in us also. And let us show it to those and all those around about us. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson. It spoke to my heart. I pray that God would touch you, encourage you, and give you strength and give you a compassionate heart. So God bless you all, and see you next week. Bye bye.